Yes, he is chairman of the American Stock Exchange, but he's also the former powerful chairman of the House Budget Committee and the former chief of staff, among the youngest ever for Lyndon Baines Johnson. Who better than to get the financial and political read on today's jarring market developments? Joining us now out of his own shop, so to speak, the chairman of the American Stock Exchange himself, James Jones. Welcome, Mr. Jones. Good to have you.
Thank you, Neil. Good to be back.
All right, we have managed to pare some of the more substantial losses on the day, Mr. Jones, in about half, but we're still looking at rather heady losses, better than 7 points in your own average, better than 55 right now in the Dow. Are we stabilizing here, or is this still a very volatile period?
Well, I'm not sure that I'd want to predict where it's going to go, but I hope it's stabilizing. It went from about the industrials down to about from 110 down to about 50 something, and I hope it stabilizes there. But the fact of the matter is we're going through some uncertain periods of time, and that creates some unpredictability in the market.
All right, now you have mentioned in the past, sir, that this is a very much consumer or investor-driven type marketplace. I wonder on days like this whether you're reminded of the fact that those same consumers and those same investors, those same customers can be driven off.
Yes, I think one of the things you're finding in this particular drop in the market is that public buyers are staying away. The public recognizes that the on-again, off-again economy doesn't seem to be getting better, and that concerns them. The entrance of Ross Perot into the presidential race sort of muddies up what the presidential contest is going to be like and what the policies of the next president will be, whomever that is. The uncertainty about the congressional elections and what that means to tax policy and investment policy. All of those uncertainties combined make public buyers sort of sit on their hands. And so that is, to me, the biggest cause of the drop we've had today.
Mr. Jones, I guess I should be careful here knowing your former Democratic past, but there is this fear of Bill Clinton that's been expressed on the street. I was speaking a little while ago with Bob Farrell, the market strategist over at Merrill Lynch, who was saying, rightly or wrongly, the street is still fearful of a Bill Clinton, and that a lot of what's going on here is indicative of that. Do you buy that?
Well, it's interesting because in past history, I guess going back most of this century, the Wall Street or the stock market has perceived a Democratic presidential administration as being anti-business and a Republican being pro-business. And consequently, the market reacts negatively to a Democrat. The fact of the matter is the statistics, particularly in post-World War II era, show that there's virtually no difference in market performance between when a Democrat or Republican is in the White House. And in fact, when I was in the White House in the Johnson administration, proportionately, the market performed better than ever, and there was a greater business recovery than any time in the post-war period. So, but that perception has to be overcome. Now, to Bill Clinton's credit, he recognizes that if he's elected, and if he is to get this economy moving again, he has to instill some confidence in the financial markets, and he's been reaching out for the past month or more in small meetings and personal calls to leaders of the financial community to talk about his economic program and to let them know that he is a moderate, that he's not a wild man, and that he will be sensitive to the financial markets.
Mr. Jones, he in fact might be a moderate, but even if you accept that premise, the fear on the street seems to be that Tom Foley and Richard Gephardt and some of the other powerful Democrats on the Hill are not, and that sort of troika of power in the favor of real liberal proverbial taxers and spenders, whether that's right or wrong, is what's haunting the street right now. Do you buy that?
Well, it's interesting because since Governor Clinton has been reaching out and saying what his program actually is, I've heard from a number of people, leaders among investment banks, who say that perhaps having Bill Clinton as president, working with the Democratic Congress, there can be more responsibility and more even-handed policies, and this, I don't think anybody believes that none of the people running for president are going to be taxed and spend. I mean, that's neither Clinton nor Bush nor Perot. I don't know of anybody on the street that believes that. Okay. So I think that the Clinton outreach program is beginning to pay off. And should he be elected, I think there will be more willingness to give him a chance than might have occurred if he hadn't reached out.
Okay, I guess we'll just see about that. But Mr. Jones, in the interim here, you're coming up on your third anniversary as chief of the American Stock Exchange, and you must be feeling that Yogi Berra sense of deja vu all over again, because you took over the day before the 190-point drubbing on October 13th, 1989 that we had at the Dow. You're reminded, of course, of the fact that October has a sort of a nasty reputation on the street. Taking a look at today's developments, are you sensing that it's happening all over again, or is that a fair summation?
No, I think every October responds to different circumstances, and the economy and the country today is different than it was 3 years ago. What we're trying to do at the American Stock Exchange is to actually implement our strategic plan of putting the customers first, the investors and the issuers of stock that's traded here, and really developing the kinds of services that allow us to trade faster, better, cheaper, and to cut costs, and to provide our companies with more services. That's what really is important to us. So far it's working. This is the first year we've implemented it. Our profitability is back up to being good. Our new listings are, I think, running ahead of all years but one.
But your volume is not what it was back in 1987 before that crash.
No,
and I'm just wondering if you...
No, you're wrong on that.
Or
our volume is 14.8 million shares a day, which is higher than it was in 1987. I think it was 13.8 at that time.
All right, but I guess what I'm asking you more to the point is whether you take a look at what is going on with the big board now, the up-and-coming NASDAQ, and whether crises such as what's going on now could push AMEX sort of right out of the sauce.
I don't think so. AMEX is a scrappy competitor. We are providing a service for mid-sized growth companies and for derivative products that no other marketplace is doing in the same way. So we expect to be here and to be very active and competitive.
All right, James Jones, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Neil.
James Jones, the chairman of the American Stock Exchange, joining us out of the American Stock Exchange. Well, stock prices remain down. Welcome to View from the Top, everyone. It's your chance to hear in depth from the movers and shakers of the financial and business world. Hello, everyone. I'm Neil Cavuto. For years now, the American Stock Exchange has been struggling to survive amidst the overwhelming prestige of the New York Stock Exchange and, of course, the steadily growing clout of the electronic over-the-counter NASDAQ market. Until now, the AMEX has managed to survive by continually expanding its product line, but can it continue to survive and flourish in these hard times? Joining us now from our bureau at the American Stock Exchange, and here to read his view on its future, it's Chairman James R. Jones. Good to have you with us, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Neil. Good to be back.
Didn't we just do this last week, sir?
It seems like we have to quit meeting like this.
All right. Well, it's good to have you. We were just speaking last week when we ended how volume and activity has certainly been picking up at the American Stock Exchange. But I'm also reminded, Mr. Jones, of just the tough economic times we're in and the simple fact that we're starting to see, outside of program-related activity, declining participation on the part of individuals. Is that worrying you?
Well, the general economic conditions in the United States and worldwide trouble me because when the economy's bad, it hits hardest at the two market niches that we pride ourselves in specializing in. Number one, the mid-sized and growth company equity market. Number two, the derivatives market. So we've seen a slight decline, particularly in the summer to fall quarters. But we've had overall this year a very good year. It's been profitable. Our trading volume is up, well over the budget. But yes, when the economy is bad in general, the area of the economy that's hit hardest are the mid-sized and the growth companies, and those are the ones we specialize in.
Well, I wonder if you don't mind, Mr. Jones, getting some either nasty little rumors out of the way or addressing them. One of them concerns maybe the possibility that you would be looking at a merger with either the New York Stock Exchange or doing something a tad more bizarre with the NASDAQ. I know you've heard these mentioned again and again, but I'm prompted to ask you, any truth to them?
Well, I don't think there are any merger talks that anybody is considering with anyone. What I have said is it makes a lot of sense at a time when the securities industry is contracting and consolidating anyway. It makes a lot of sense for markets to look to be more efficient. And one of the things that I think both we and the New York Stock Exchange should explore more thoroughly is how can we do things together that will improve the efficiency and reduce the costs of our trading systems. After all, the primary auction markets trade very similarly. We trade in different market niches. But if we can do things together to cut costs, improve speed and efficiency, then I think we've done a public service for the public.
All right, let's switch political gears here. And I want to maybe have you think, as a former chairman of the House Budget Committee, as also one of the youngest White House chiefs of staff in history, and take a look at the presidential debates last night, Mr. Jones. The feeling seems to be that since George Bush didn't deliver any knockout punch, that the election is Bill Clinton's to lose. If that is the case, I guess I'm tempted to ask you whether the market fallout that so many seem to be looking at as a virtual given is going to materialize.
Well, I think Bill Clinton is very sensitive to how the financial markets might accept his election as president. And he's been reaching out in small groups and individual calls to leaders in the financial community to sort of reassure them that he is not a wild-eyed liberal, that he's very much a moderate, he's very much pro-business.
Well, I think their argument, Mr. Jones, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but their argument was that he might not be, but Dick Gephardt is, Tom Foley is, Senator Ted Kennedy is, and that these people are going to dictate policy on the Hill.
Well, I don't think that anybody from the Hill is going to dictate policy. I worked for Lyndon Johnson, and it was an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress, and yet Lyndon Johnson was the one who dictated policy, and I might add, the best years for the stock market post-World War II were during the Johnson administration years.
But a very liberal fellow.
Well, it depends on how you look at it. The last time we had a balanced budget in this country was the last year of the Johnson administration, and I'm very proud of that record, so that you can meet social needs and still be fiscally responsible.
Well, why this fear then, Mr. Jones? And I know we know the fact that it's a Republican bastion, but you obviously are a bit of an exception in this Republican bastion, a noted former Democrat. Would you or could you entertain the possibility that Wall Street would in fact like a President Clinton?
Well, I think it all depends on how a President Clinton performs. If he will do what he has indicated he would do, and that is, number one, initially try to get the economy moving again, and then follow that up by some serious deficit reduction, then I think, yes, Wall Street, the financial markets would accept him and would applaud what he did and not react negatively. If, on the other hand, those were false promises, obviously they would react that way. And that's true whether it's a George Bush or a Ross Perot or a Bill Clinton.
All right, Mr. Jones, what about you? You know the rumors on the personal front here that you might have a very important role to play in a Clinton administration, that he might tap you for, let's say, chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission or something like that. What about that?
I don't expect that to happen. Number one, it's not unusual to have someone with my background in government to be speculated as part of a Clinton Democratic administration.
Well, have they talked to you, sir?
No, no one has talked to me. I am not campaigning for it.
Have you resigned a contract at the American Stock Exchange?
Yes, the Board of Governors last week unanimously extended my contract. I have a job to do here at the American Stock Exchange.
Did that stipulate, Mr. Jones, that you not take a job in government?
No, there's no stipulations.
All right, so you would entertain at least staying where you are now, even if, let's say, an offer were made from the Clinton folks to join the camp?
Well, I think those are all sort of speculative pieces or questions, and I don't expect them to happen. As I say, there are a number of well-qualified Democrats who are campaigning for these jobs. I'm not campaigning. I'm very pleased in trying to do what we're doing here at the AMEX, and I can expect to continue to do so.
All right. Now, I hate to beat a dead horse, and you've been very patient on this issue, but if I were President-elect Clinton, let's say, and I tell you, Jim Jones, I need your expertise at the SEC or the Treasury, what would you say to me?
Well, obviously, if a president of the United States said to anyone in the United States that you're the only person that can handle this job, you don't say no to the president. But I've been around, and those things just don't happen.
All right. Jim Jones, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Neil.
He is the chairman of the American Stock Exchange. James R. Jones joining us from his home, the American Stock Exchange. Speaking of which, that composite is currently up about 0.5 point.
presents dialogue, an unrehearsed televised exchange of ideas. Now, live from our studios in Washington, D.C., here is your host, broadcast journalist, Lloyd Avelilla. Hello and welcome to WorldNet's Dialogue. The United States, Mexico, and Canada are increasing cooperation in expectation of NAFTA's enactment. Each of the many business, trade, and financial areas affected, and especially financial markets, is now experiencing an exciting time, anticipating increased opportunities for growth and investment. But along with increased opportunities come responsibilities, and keeping both in perspective during this transition time is the focus of today's dialogue. Joining me today to explore the ins and outs of financial markets under NAFTA are two uniquely qualified authorities. First, Commissioner Mary Shapiro of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, who has been involved in domestic and international financial markets regulation since 1980, and for the past 2 years has worked extensively with Mexico. Before being appointed to the Commission, Ms. Shapiro was General Counsel and Senior Vice President for the Futures Industry Association, an organization of 300 large brokerage firms, domestic and international futures exchanges, banks, law and accounting firms, and market users. Also with us is Mr. James Jones, who has been Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the American Stock Exchange since 1989. Prior to becoming chairman, he served as a member of the exchange's Board of Governors and was a Washington law partner. Mr. Jones was also a congressman and the White House Chief of Staff for President Lyndon Johnson. It is a great pleasure to welcome you both to WorldNet's Dialogue.
Thank you very much.
I know our participants in Mexico City are eager to speak with you, so let's begin the discussion. In Mexico City, our panel members, I'm sure, have their questions ready. So let us go directly to their questions. Please go ahead, Mexico City, with your questions and comments. I'm Eduardo Valdez, speaking to you from Mexico. I have a question for Ms. Shapiro. What differences and structural changes do you expect to see in the U.S. financial system under a Democratic administration, under Mr. Bill Clinton?
Well, I think that you won't see a lot of major structural changes in the U.S. financial system under a Clinton administration. Bill Clinton has not spoken extensively on issues like banking regulation or securities regulation. He has said that he would undertake a serious review of the banking structure. He's been a strong advocate for the development of community banks in the United States, and he's clearly aware of the need for modernizing the banking system in the U.S., and his aides have even spoken to the specific issue of interstate branching. But I don't think that there would be many fundamental changes under a Clinton administration. There may be renewed efforts, certainly there have been under the Bush administration, to do some comprehensive banking overhaul in the U.S., repeal of Glass-Steagall, interstate branching again, limitations on the deposit insurance program, things like that, coupled with some regulatory reform that might include the end of the too big to fail doctrine and protection of weaker banks and earlier regulatory intervention. Those were things that were important to the Bush administration and were important to a number of members of Congress and may ultimately be important under a Clinton administration.
Could I just add to that? When I was in Congress representing a district in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was the neighboring state of Arkansas, I came to know Bill Clinton. I've known him about 12 years. And while Commissioner Shapiro is correct, he has not spoken out specifically on what he would do about changing the laws affecting financial institutions. I think that he is tugged in two directions. As Mary Shapiro pointed out, number one, because of where he comes from, he's very tied into smaller communities and the banking institutions that help smaller communities either grow or wither. And so I think he would do whatever possible to strengthen the community bank system. He is also very much an internationalist, and a number of the people he's been reaching out to in the financial services industry come from a viewpoint that says Glass-Steagall must be changed in some fundamental ways, and that the whole banking structure needs to be looked at and modernized instead of dealing in a pigeonhole way of commercial banking and investment banking. They need to be thinking more about overall financial institutions. So I think that a Clinton administration probably would advance some more review and reform of the banking laws, and move toward repealing at least most of what's left of the Glass-Steagall Act.
If I could also add to that one other point, Bill Clinton has said in a speech that he knows and understands that Citibank, which is the largest bank in the United States, is now ranked, or at least at the end of 1991, was ranked only the 23rd largest in the world, and that it's absolutely clear that something needs to be done to increase the competitiveness of the U.S. banking system.
Mr. Stinkting from AMEX, and my question is also from Mary Shapiro. Given the Glass-Steagall Act, what restrictions would apply to Mexican groups or businesses based in Washington or the United States?
Well, the United States affords national treatment to Mexican or any other country's financial institutions. That means, unfortunately, in the United States, Glass-Steagall would apply to Mexican financial institutions. One of the great things about NAFTA, from our perspective, is that for U.S. banks, when they are afforded national treatment ultimately under NAFTA, they will in fact be able to do more different kinds of business in Mexico than they can do right now in the United States. I know there's a lot of interest in Mexico, and I've been asked often when I've been there, what are the chances for modification of Glass-Steagall or the repeal of Glass-Steagall? I think that's extremely difficult to predict right now. As I said earlier, there was a great commitment to reform, including Glass-Steagall repealed during the Bush administration. Excuse me. And that repeal was going to be part of a comprehensive approach to banking reform, linking new powers and Glass-Steagall repeal to regulatory changes. But I think to predict right now the passage of Glass-Steagall repeal with a largely new Congress next year, given the difficulties that we've had overall in the S&L and the banking area, is very, very difficult for us to predict. And I wouldn't go out on a limb to do that right now.
I might just add to that, while I basically stick to what I said previously, that there would be some serious modification of Glass-Steagall in a Clinton administration or even in a Bush administration. I don't think it's going to be a priority item in the new Congress. There will be 25 to 35% of the Congress will be new people, and this would be the largest turnover in our Congress probably since 1948, maybe since 1932. We don't know exactly what that new Congress is going to look like in terms of philosophical beliefs, etc. I do think that there is going to be a number of other things on their menu to accomplish before they get to changing the banking laws. So even though I believe that there will be a serious look at trying to amend Glass-Steagall, I don't think that's going to be a priority item that will be dealt with right off the bat.
I'm Efren de Rosal with the Mexican Association of stock exchanges, and I'm going to be shifting the subject. What we're really interested in is the issues pertaining to how to internationalize the Mexican stock market. This is something that our market has grown as a result of capital flows from the U.S. to Mexico. A significant step was taken recently regarding the recognition of the ready market category for 18 Mexican issuers. The Mexican government, for some years, has been deregulating almost to an absolute level foreign investment in our market, making it more flexible. Almost all instruments are accessible. In view of this, what would be the next steps to take so that the CNB in Mexico, which has been working with the SEC in the U.S., can agree on the ready market category so as to have a broader market? Also, regarding a more specific issue, I would like to ask what you can tell us about what would happen after the enactment of NAFTA with the so-called Blue Sky Acts at the state level and the exemptions which could be given to government bonds and other instruments in Mexico so that they can be purchased by U.S. investors.
Well, it's a big question. The SEC and the CNV in Mexico have a wonderful close relationship, and we work on virtually a daily basis on a variety of issues for the very reason you've said, that there's enormous cross-border flow of securities and cash between Mexico and the United States. Just this year, through June, there was about $25 billion worth of cross-border investment activity between Mexico and the United States. And I think that that's really quite a remarkable number. The ready market issue is one that the SEC and the CNV have worked on specifically in the last 6 months. As you know, about a year ago, the SEC designated 11 Mexican equity securities as ready market securities. The benefit of that is that U.S. broker-dealers who have a great desire to hold Mexican securities can do so without taking the full capital charge, and so it's therefore much less costly for them to hold Mexican securities. The CNV has been good advocates for the Mexican industry, and they have constantly come back to the SEC and said, can't you add this security and can't you add that security to the list of readily marketable securities? Because it's become a very time and resource intensive undertaking to evaluate each new security for ready market status, the SEC decided that a better approach might be to try to find an objective standard that we could use so that we would all know right away what securities were deemed readily marketable. As a result, we decided about 2 months ago that we would adopt the Financial Times Actuaries Mexico Index standard for determining ready market securities. That immediately bumped up the number from 11 securities to 18. Now, I recognize that doesn't include all of the securities that the CNV would like to have had designated, although it does include some that the CNV hadn't proposed to the SEC to designate. So we've had a little bit of a compromise in that area. It doesn't include Mexican government securities. We continue to look at those and evaluate them, and it's my hope that in some time in the future we will be able to add Mexican government debt to the ready market list, but that just has not been possible yet. With respect to the question about the blue sky laws, that's a problem not just for foreign issuers but also for U.S. issuers. And we have a system in the United States that permits each state to also regulate the securities offerings within that state. So rather than dealing with one regulator, you have to deal with 51 regulators. There are exemptions to the blue sky laws, notably for securities that are listed on national securities exchanges, and that's been one way that foreign issuers have been able to handle the situation of having to qualify in 51 states. I'm afraid I can't give you a lot of comfort on that issue, except to tell you that it's something that the SEC works very hard with the states on, and we're hopeful that sometime in the future we will be able to achieve a system that has the states playing primarily an enforcement role and less of a regulatory role when it comes to foreign government offerings.
Let me just add one other point to that. Obviously, the American Stock Exchange being one of the national exchanges, we have blue sky exemption for the securities listed on our exchange. And we've worked quite closely with the NASA, the National Association of Securities Administrators, the state securities administrators, and I would suggest that if you have not made contact with the chairman of the State Security Commissioner organization, that you do so. They have an office in Washington, and I think it would be helpful to begin a dialogue with the NASA so that perhaps these issues can be worked out over time.
I'm Gerardo Valdez with the Multiva Group. My question is addressed to Mr. Jones, but I would also like to hear the views of Ms. Shapiro. In Mexico, we're trying to develop a stock market system similar to the NASDAQ, which is a computerized system. It would be in the image and likeness of the Vancouver system. My question is, why would it be important for Mexico to have the current system with a floor like the stock market floor, like the one in New York, in addition to a computerized system?
Well, let me try to address that. Obviously, the American Stock Exchange, like the New York Stock Exchange, has a trading floor. It has brokers and traders on the trading floor with specialists handling the stock. That is not to say that we're not highly computerized. We have well over half of the trades that are done on the American Stock Exchange floor are done by computer, electronically. They do not go through the open outcry or anything like that. And as we look to the future, there's going to be more and more electronic trading. However, our market niche at the American Stock Exchange is the mid-sized and the growth company market. We believe very strongly that the human element of having a specialist with a very specific obligation and responsibility to take the other side of the market when buyers or sellers are not there, and to keep that market liquid and operating, particularly when the market is somewhat volatile or in a down cycle. We think that is a very important element, and that the human element is extremely important. Now, my personal judgment is that in the United States, the so-called dealer market or electronic market and the auction market, as we have at the American and the New York Stock Exchange, they will be adapting to the best of each other's markets. In other words, we are going to continually upgrade our own technology and our computer systems and do more and more electronic trading. I think the dealer market and any other market that's looking to emulate the NASDAQ market will have to put on more affirmative obligations on the dealers so that they can't just walk away from a market when the market is in a free fall, for example. So as I see the future, you're going to try to probably get the best of both worlds. The London Stock Exchange went from a centralized floor market in, 1986, to a dispersed dealer market, electronic market. And one of the things they've found within the last year or so is that this dispersed electronic market works for, say, the top 500 companies where liquidity is not much of a problem. But they needed something else to help the lower 1,700 companies, the smaller capitalized companies, in order to keep a good liquid continuous market. And they sent a team to New York and looked at our market, and I think that human element is very important, particularly when you're talking about mid-sized and smaller capitalized companies.
Well, the SEC, we are very fond of saying that we're completely agnostic when it comes to market systems. And the fact is that that really is true. We regulate all kinds of markets. Automated systems like the NASDAQ with market makers, traditional open outcry, trading floors like the AMEX that utilize specialists. And the SEC really doesn't take a position about which kind of market works better. They all seem to work pretty well, in fact. The automation, as Jim Jones says, is terribly important, whether it's a traditional floor or a fully automated system. And I think expenditures for automating at least certain components of the trading system are very, very wisely made. In any event, at the other end of the process, automation is very important to the transparency of the process and the transparency of the system. And I think that to have electronic systems for price reporting and volume reporting on a real-time basis are very important to the marketplace.
Moises Tington again. I would now like to turn to the subject of the entry times for financial intermediaries in Mexico. What do you think would happen in 3 to 5 years with having associations involving Mexican brokers and dealers and those in the U.S., intermediaries in the U.S.?
Well, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to give kind of a long answer to this question because I've thought a lot about specifically the transition periods that are provided for NAFTA. And I want to say up front that I think the key thing and the very important thing is that NAFTA will allow U.S. firms to establish locally in Mexico and do business ultimately. But I think almost equally important is that NAFTA is really an evolutionary step in the financial services evolution of Mexico, and not really so much revolutionary. Mexico, when it joined GATT in 1986, really started the whole process of trade liberalization in a very fundamental way. And NAFTA has essentially become the culmination of that step, and of course the step that's most focused on financial services from our perspective. If you look at the history of Mexico and U.S. cross-border investment and the flow of financial services across border, it seems to me that it's clear that the opening up of the Mexican financial services system was going to happen eventually with or without NAFTA. There are half a dozen or so Mexican broker-dealers doing business in the United States. There are Mexican companies, 6 of them publicly traded in the United States, and another 20 or so that have done very significant 144A offerings in the U.S. market for somewhere in the vicinity of $5 billion. So we were headed in this direction anyway, but NAFTA is important because it will create in January of 1994 the opportunity to immediately establish local firms, albeit with some transition periods that are perhaps a little bit longer than we might like to have seen if we could have had everything our way. But obviously the agreement is a negotiated one, and there was give and take on both sides, and we ended up with transition periods. But again, the important thing is that there's a binding commitment to remove all of the barriers ultimately to a U.S. firm or a Canadian firm either buying a Mexican brokerage firm or bank or establishing a subsidiary in Mexico. I think the other important part of that is national treatment, and from our perspective, that's critically important for the ability of a U.S. firm to do business in Mexico the way that a Mexican firm can do business in Mexico. And of course, that's the treatment that's already afforded to Mexican firms in the United States. I guess if I can turn the tables a little bit, I'd like to know what you all think about the transition periods. We tend to look at them in the United States as a period that will end essentially in the year 2000. Hopefully all of the market share limitations will be gone by then, both the aggregate market share limitations for all foreign firms and the individual per share market cap. But I think Mexico tends to look at those as having the potential to go on quite a bit longer, as the agreement provides that there can be some limitations to the year 2007. And I would be interested to know how you, in the brokerage community especially, are viewing those market share transitional periods.
I would say that it is seen as a challenge and an opportunity more so than a competition. The transition period, as you said, is fairly long, and we feel that it's important to take into account the fact that the treaty does allow for an establishment of subsidiaries, which would mean a different treatment of the equity or capital for financial intermediaries in Mexico. Well, the levels would be different if we look at the Mexican intermediaries. Their cap or maximum is lower than that of American intermediaries. So the possibility of having subsidiaries is really a source of great satisfaction for us. We would say that we see the NAFTA as a possibility to establish associations that will allow our market to grow.
I think that's very positive, and I think that that's how we would view it as well. The U.S. markets have benefited enormously from the presence of foreign firms in it, and I think that that same benefit would accrue to Mexico. I should add that from our perspective, the standstill provision, which permits the same or an accelerated amount of cross-border financial transactions to take place, is a very, very key part of the NAFTA agreement. There are some issues, however, that I hope we will resolve over time, either informally or formally with the CNV, or through the consultative process, that perhaps won't wait either till the year 2000 or the year 2007. And those might include looking, for example, at the net capital requirements of broker-dealers. Our rules are quite different in that regard. Your minimum levels are very, very high for our brokerage firms. And I think we also need to look at the issue of U.S. investment advisor and U.S. mutual fund access to the Mexican market. But I would agree with your overall assessment that NAFTA will be very, very good for both the U.S. and the Mexican broker-dealer and banking communities.
I'm Efren de Rosal with the Association of Stock Exchange. I have a question for Mr. Jones. It's going to be a fairly lengthy question, but I'll try to organize my thoughts well so that you can answer it in sequence. In view of the importance of the medium-sized business sector in Mexico, could you tell us, in an international context, looking at the stock exchange in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world, what could be the advantages for our firms to be listed on the American Stock Exchange? We would also be interested in knowing how international that stock market is. In other words, how many foreign firms are listed? And I would add another more specific question after this. The exemptions that could be obtained by being traded on the American Stock Exchange, could you give us other experiences you have heard of with bonds from other countries or even private bonds?
Okay, let me say, first of all, the importance to mid-sized businesses to be listed on the American Stock Exchange. If you're wanting to raise capital in the United States, I think it's very important that a company be listed. The advantages of the American Stock Exchange over perhaps the other markets is that the medium-sized business market niche is the one that we have staked out for ourselves. We believe that these kinds of companies, because they're not household names, perhaps not as well known, need a whole array of other services, particularly investor relations services, that enable them to present their case and to be better known to the financial community in the United States. And we have a whole range of those kinds of services. For example, we have what we call brokerage services in about 30 cities that allows a company to make its case to the top level broker community in about 30 cities across the country. We have a security analyst forum which allows a company, whether it's an international company or a domestic company, to present its case to the institutional analysts so that they can get better coverage and be discovered more. So those kinds of services, I think, are very important for companies, mid-sized companies that are not that well known. As far as the American Stock Exchange and the role we play in the international arena, what other international companies are listed, on a percentage basis, we have more than any other market. We have something like 80 to 90 international companies. Most of those are Canadian companies. For reasons that go back in history, we have most of the Canadian companies that list in the United States are on the American Stock Exchange, and they range, a lot of them are energy-related companies, but there are also other kinds of companies from Canada. We, in our own efforts since I've been at the American Stock Exchange, have been reaching out to begin to develop alliances with other stock markets, both in emerging countries, emerging markets, as well as more developed markets. And right now, the most important strategic initiative that we have is a Latin American strategic initiative, starting with Mexico, and then in Chile and Argentina. And part of that is because my own personal involvement in trying to get the NAFTA approved in the United States and to do everything we can to develop a free market zone in the North American continent. And my belief that we're going to have to extend NAFTA through Central and South America so that we will truly be the most important free market trading area in the entire world. And to me, to make that, to cement the success of that kind of a market, you have to have credible, mature, interrelated financial markets to finance the companies that are trying to raise capital. And so we're making a special initiative at the American Stock Exchange, starting with Mexico, to try to open up the avenues of raising capital in the United States to Mexican companies, and then we will follow that with Chile and Argentina and other countries as they develop and come into this sort of free trade regime. So those are some of the things. I think I've touched on most of your question. I hope I've hit it. If not, come back at me.
I'm Gerardo Valdez, and my question goes to both Ms. Shapiro and Mr. Jones. Lately in Mexico, we've heard much talk about a cruel alternative, which sometimes we have to choose between innovation and I would like to know, in general terms, if you could tell me what would be the strategy that you think would make our financial systems most effective in deciding when to regulate and when not to regulate the financial system. And what would Mexico have to do, legally speaking, to make its legal framework more closely similar to that of the United States?
It's a great question, when to regulate and when not to regulate. And it's one that we, in fact, face at the SEC every day, even though the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States has been in existence for almost 60 years. The CNV in Mexico does a superb job from our perspective. I work with regulators throughout the emerging markets of the world and throughout Latin America. And the people who work for the CNV in Mexico are among the most professional and hardworking I have ever met anywhere. They need to, and they are, I think, developing a regulatory system that fits with Mexico and cannot exactly copy what the United States has done with its SEC. And certainly you don't want a system exactly like ours. You don't want 51 state regulators. But that aside, I think the guiding principle for any regulatory system really has to be balance. Maintaining the balance between protecting the public investors, protecting the integrity of the market through adequate capitalization for financial intermediaries, a sound clearance and settlement system, efficient payment, transfer of securities, with the need to let corporations come to the market and issue securities and raise capital for growth and production of inventory and provision of jobs. There's no magic formula, I think, for finding that balance. It really needs to be a partnership between government and industry. It needs to be a transparent process whereby industry has the opportunity to give its point of view to government on particular regulatory proposals. And industry has to respect, I think, the abilities of the regulator and take their guidance also very seriously. It's an easy question and it's a difficult question because it's something that you can speak to in generalities, but very difficult to speak to in specifics. But I do think the CNV is attempting to develop a regulatory system that meets the needs of Mexico, which are rapidly developing and changing. And to the extent the SEC in Washington can be of help in doing that, we want to be of help. We try very hard not to preach our system is the only system, but we do think there are some things that we do very well, and we're willing to share that experience with anybody who's willing to listen to it.
Well, I would just add to what Mary has said that the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington truly has been reaching out and wants to assist in any emerging market to develop a credible regulatory system without copying necessarily everything that our SEC does. I have been visited just in the brief 3 years I've been at the American Stock Exchange by emerging market representatives from all over the world, Asia, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and Latin America. When they ask me what do they need to do, the thing that I say that is first and foremost and most important is to establish a fair market, a credible market, a transparent market. I fully recognize that in many of these markets, and perhaps even in the United States, the professional is the most important player in terms of volume and trades and things like that. But for a marketplace to be credible, there has to be that sense of fair play for the public at large. If the public loses confidence in a marketplace, then the free market principles have lost also. And if the public in a particular marketplace loses confidence, that means foreign investors are going to lose confidence. And confidence is the most important thing, in my judgment, to keep a free market system going and moving forward. So in my judgment, even though I'm in private business now, you don't want to be over-regulated. You really do have to have a serious regulatory regime that says to the public investor, you get a fair chance along with the professional. The other thing that I think needs to be done, especially between and among Canada, United States, and Mexico, is to work very, very hard at the government and private level to have a more common system of reporting, a more common system of accounting, so that there really will be no barriers, barriers that are visible or even some that are less visible to the free flow of finance and trade across our borders.
If I could add to that, what Jim has said, I agree with completely, and I guess I would go a little bit further. Having spoken about the importance of a strong regulator and achieving that balance to create the integrity and credibility for the market, I think self-regulation for Mexico is also very, very important. We have a system in the United States of enormous reliance upon self-regulatory organizations as the first line of defense in ensuring the integrity of the financial intermediaries, ensuring that customers are treated fairly, and arbitrating disputes between customers and brokerage firms, as well as, in fact, running the marketplace itself. But I think I gave a speech in Mexico just 2 weeks ago where I talked about all the opportunities I thought NAFTA presented. And I put my regulator's hat on at the end of it to talk about the responsibilities I think it presents as well. And I talked about self-regulation, but it really means much more than the Bolsa acting as a self-regulatory organization. It also means that the broker-dealer firms, the salesmen, the other financial intermediaries, including the banks, the accountants and the lawyers who prepare the financial disclosure documents that accompany a public offering, all have in mind that they are integral to the self-regulatory system, and that it is upon them that the entire system depends, and that without integrity on the part of those people, there's no integrity to the system, regardless of how good and how strong your regulator is. And I guess I would feel that if I didn't add that, I wouldn't be talking very completely about the role of regulation in the development of the market.
Moises Tingting again. Speaking about the transition involved in the NAFTA, there is strong concern among the mid-sized and small firms in Mexico regarding the high investment requirements and the high capital costs involved in the opening of the economy. You mentioned the AMEX and the possibility of mid-sized firms, Mr. Jones. What possibilities do you see for mid-sized firms in Mexico which are faced with a difficult situation now, lack of liquidity, high capital cost, and also sizable investment requirements in order to be able to open and participate?
Are you talking about investment banks? Or are you talking about companies trying to raise capital in the United States?
I'm speaking in general terms to Mexican firms in whatever sector that are trying to raise funds, in whatever area it may be.
Well, I think our capital markets for companies trying to raise capital in the U.S. are probably as efficient, if not the most efficient in the world, and therefore the cost of capital, I think, is much less in the United States. One of the advantages of listing on an exchange such as the AMEX is the efficiency, the liquidity, and all of that goes to reducing the cost of capital, of raising capital. There are a lot of other costs that go along with the regulatory features that we have in this country, a lot of legal costs that run up into lots and lots of money. One of the things that we have done at the American Stock Exchange is to put out a handbook to help companies, guide them through the process of being eligible to raise capital in the United States. Hopefully, some of that will help them reduce some of their costs, legal and administrative costs of registering. Mary, do you want to add anything to that? Okay.
Pretty complete.
Efren de Rosal again. Now, speaking of the reaction, and my question first of all goes to Ms. Shapiro primarily. Speaking now about the reaction that U.S. intermediaries could have, those who are subject to the national treatment in Mexico, once the agreement goes into force, what can we expect? Do you think they will pressure the Congress to obtain greater openness in the national stock market? And, well, now we know why it's important for Mexico to have a gradual transition period for national treatment. But I would like to know if through local laws and regulations in the U.S. it would be possible for these intermediaries to participate in stock trading in Mexico. Let me give you a specific example. Small and medium-sized brokers have been pressuring to be able to participate in offerings in Mexico and elsewhere, and there seem to be state laws that allow them to participate. I don't know if my question has been clear.
I'm afraid not very clear. Let me answer the first part of it, whether there will be pressure on the Congress to force further opening. I don't think Jim or I have said this yet, but I think we both fully expect that NAFTA will be passed by the United States Congress, and we hope it will be passed by the Mexican Senate, so that we will be on schedule for the opening of the financial markets in Mexico for the access of U.S. brokerage firms and banks. I guess I'm not exactly clear what you were getting at with respect to the second part of the question.
Well, we have heard expressions of interest from broker groups in those states bordering Mexico. These are small brokers, but they have told us that there are some formulas that under local U.S. laws would allow them to participate in large securities offerings in Mexico, which, as you know, are often placed by large U.S. firms. I would like to know if you have any specific laws that will guarantee them a share of that participation.
No, there are no laws that I know of, but I'm not an expert on every state's law. There are no laws that I know of that would guarantee small brokerage firms the opportunity to participate in underwriting a large Mexican offering. What is probably the primary impediment to their doing so are the SEC's capital requirements, and whether these firms are sufficiently capitalized to be involved in very large transactions. I think that would be the major impediment. Unlike in the banking area, there are no requirements for participation of small firms in offerings.
If part of that question was to ask whether some of these border state smaller firms would have the political clout, say in a Clinton administration, to reopen NAFTA and renegotiate that part, I would believe very strongly that that would not be the case. I think the NAFTA, as it pertains to Mexico, United States, and Canada, will be voted on up or down, and I agree with Mary that I think it will pass our Congress. If there are going to be any changes, they will only apply to what we do in the United States, not what the relationship inside the United States is to Mexico. So I would not expect it to be renegotiated.
I'm Gerardo Valdez. I would like to go back to a question I made a while ago about how to decide whether to innovate or regulate in the U.S. style. Let us take the case of the United States. How do you decide, let us say in the case of new products, futures markets, for example, or derivatives, does the authority allow for the market to develop these products and then regulates them, or is it the other way around? Does it start out trying to regulate them from the very beginning? The problem we're seeing in our countries, in general terms, in Latin America, that are trying to develop their financial markets, is precisely that it's not quite clear as to what comes first, whether regulations, or should we allow the market to innovate freely and then let the actors involved decide how much regulation should be applied.
I think that in the United States you will find the experience has been in both regards. In some cases, the futures markets, for example, the futures markets were developed and widely used, particularly in the agricultural sector, long before there was any regulation of those markets. They really didn't come under regulation in any comprehensive way until 1974, when the CFTC was created. They had existed since the late 1800s. So you see regulation that results from an innovation by the private sector. And I should say that the private sector is the driving force for almost all innovation in the U.S. markets. The SEC does not sit around, for the most part, and think up new products and offer them to the private sector and then decide how to regulate them. They are virtually all generated by the private sector, and then the regulators catch up to find a way to regulate. Ideally, the regulation of a new product and the development of a new product go hand in hand. And we have seen that recently at the SEC with the development of some new types of mutual funds that are between the closed-end and open-end mutual funds. Those ideas to create those kinds of new funds have arisen in the last few months, and the SEC is working on a regulatory structure for them, essentially simultaneously with the development of the new concept by the industry. That's one of the rare examples where the two things actually move together at the same time. Far more often, regulators are playing catch-up. I think an important part of this debate, though, is what the role of the regulator should be in new product development. And I feel very strongly that the integrity of the regulatory system depends upon the regulators having, at least in some measure, an arm's length relationship with the industry and with people who are developing new products, and that the regulator ought not be out marketing the market and pushing new products on industry or the private sector, or out there hyping the market or any particular product within the market. That creates a lot of problems eventually as markets mature and regulators are caught in the position of then having to become sterner regulators, and they've developed perhaps too close a relationship to the marketplace. If I can give one last example, right now in the United States we're examining very closely the development of the over-the-counter derivative markets, primarily the swap market. That is a largely unregulated market in the United States. It is a huge market when you look at interest rate and foreign currency swaps, much smaller when you look at the equity derivatives. And we're just now coming to terms, the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the SEC, and the CFTC, with whether that ought to be a regulated market, whose responsibility it ought to be, and what form the regulation should take. But this is a case where we have an enormous over-the-counter market already in existence, and essentially no regulatory controls in place.
Let me add just a couple of other things. The American Stock Exchange, as I've already mentioned, is a primary auction market for mid-sized and growth companies' equities. We're also, I think, the largest derivatives market, where when you take our options, our warrants, our CVRs, and a lot of new derivative products that we've established, that's the other part of our market. The first thing I would say about the derivatives market, or the total marketplace, is if there's any advice we could give you, is don't follow what the United States has done. In other words, have one regulatory jurisdiction. Don't divide it up between certain kinds of derivative products and then certain kinds of equity products. Have one regulator who can look at the whole picture. We have made a mistake in the United States, and we're going to try to correct that over the next few years. The second thing I would mention is that I think the development of these derivative products is going to be more and more important as the true globalization of financial markets is a reality. Options and various kinds of derivatives are going to be a form of relatively inexpensive insurance to hedge against basic investments in another country in their equity securities. So I think it's going to be a market that's going to grow considerably over the next several years. The private sector has to be the driving force in developing these products, and it's the regulator that sort of puts on the brakes or catches up to what the private sector is doing. We have a product before the Securities and Exchange Commission that's been there for almost 2 years now, because it doesn't neatly fall into their pigeonhole of products that they've already approved. It's sort of a cross between a unit investment trust and a mutual fund. It is finally working its way through the SEC. while I may be a little frustrated with the slowness of it, I recognize that the SEC does need to protect the public interest and make sure this is not a flim-flam product. And so it's the regulator catching up with the private initiative, but I think that's the way it ought to be.
Now, with this last comment, we have come to the end of today's program. I wish to thank all of our participants in Mexico City, as well as our guests here in the studio, Commissioner Mary Shapiro and Mr. James Jones, for joining us today. Thank you very much for your comments. And from Washington, for WorldNet's Dialogue, I'm Loida Velilla.
Today marks the 5th anniversary of the 1987 stock market crash, which of course became known as Black Monday. New York One's Michael O'Looney takes a look back.
October 19th, 1987, Black Monday on Wall Street. For weeks there were fears that the economy was reaching its peak. Interest rates were climbing and the dollar appeared to be in a free fall. Then on that fateful October day 5 years ago, panic swept the market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged more than 500 points in fewer than 7 hours. The question many people are asking today is, could it happen again? James Jones is chairman and CEO of the American Stock Exchange. He says it's not likely we'll see a repeat of the crash of 1987.
I think we learned a lot of lessons from 1987, and it's much safer than it was then. You're never 100% chance safety, whether it's a tornado or a hurricane or a stock market.
One result of the crash of 1987 was the implementation of safeguards aimed at slowing a runaway market. Most traders say those safeguards should keep the market in check.
I don't think something like that could possibly happen in the near future, because we have circuit breakers in effect now that if the market is down 250 points, we halt trading for an hour. And if the market is down 400 points, we halt trading for 2 hours.
84-year-old Michael Pascuma has been through it all on Wall Street. He was working on the trading floor during both the 1929 market crash and the crash of '87. Pascuma says the biggest difference between those two crashes is that in 1929, there were a lot more people who should have never been in the stock market to begin with.
I think that's the reason why you had the casualties that you had in '29 when the terrible break came. Some of these people jumped out the window and they went up to their ears, probably owed money because of the terrible crash it was at the time. They didn't have maybe a chance to get out.
Stock specialist Joel Kaufman thinks current investors have learned to roll with the punches.
I think the public has become more sophisticated, and they've learned not to panic, not to sell on rallies, and perhaps even to do some buying when they think the prices are getting down to the proper level.
While analysts say there is always the danger that the stock market could again drop dramatically, they say the next sell-off will most likely be a slow eroding kind of market, as opposed to the violent crash we saw in 1987. On Wall Street, Michael O'Looney, New York One.
Where were you?
Years ago on this day when the stock market crashed, and since then the government and the markets have been taking steps to try to avoid another sudden dive. But how sure can we be there'll be no repeat of Black Monday? A perspective from First Business correspondent Jim Nash.
It was called Black Monday 5 years ago when the Dow dropped 508 points in a wave of panic selling. A 23% devaluation of the market in a single day. The sell-off swept around the world after a buildup of months of speculative buying. But when the market suddenly turned, massive sales were triggered by computerized program trading, which triggered panic and more sell-offs. On Chicago commodities markets, the so-called portfolio insurance had encouraged speculation. But now there are circuit breakers, an automatic trading shutdown if the Dow moves up or down 50 points in a day. And the chairman, CEO of the American Stock Exchange, says another crash like Black Monday is unlikely because of safeguards.
The other aspect that we found in 1989 was the markets between London, Tokyo, and New York seemed to be related to each other, even though the events were not related. And I think the markets have become much more sophisticated since then, so that what happens in Tokyo, if it relates to Japanese problems, doesn't spill over into New York or into London, and so forth.
If 5 years ago people were being told that real estate was a safe investment and stocks were risky, what's changed now?
I recall 10 years ago, Business Week put out the death of equities issue with the market as measured by the Dow at about 800. We are now at 3,200, and all we see is articles about how the risk of being out of the market might be greater than the risk of being in the market.
So, as they say, if you're looking for a guarantee that another Black Monday won't come along and wipe you out, stick with savings bonds. But as for now, the stock market seems a little safer than 5 years ago today. Jim Nash, First Business.
And hello from New York, I'm Aaron Brown. Lisa returns to a speaking role on the broadcast tomorrow. In the news at this hour, 5 years ago today, the nation was on an 80s high. The big money was flowing, the stock market was booming, and then within the space of just a few hours, a stunned world watched as it all unwound. The stock market took a plunge that most people believed was unthinkable. But in the wake of that mad Monday came efforts to prevent a repeat of such a financial chaos. Here's ABC's Sheila Cast.
Traders who lived through Black Monday call it panic selling, a circus, a bloodbath. The Dow plunged 508 points. The market lost 23% of its value in a single day.
Well, I'd call it the nearest thing to a meltdown I ever want to see.
Officials set out to keep the panic from repeating itself with a set of reforms, like circuit breakers, which restrict computerized trading when the Dow falls or rises 50 points, or could halt trading entirely for an hour if the Dow were to fall 250 points in one session.
It's much safer than it was, but you can never guarantee absolute safety.
We're much better prepared today from the market's point of view than we were in October of '87.
It's not just market mechanisms, but investors who have changed.
These days, it seems like they're more mature, more calm, less likely to panic about what's going on in the market on a day-to-day basis.
The marketing firm Ogilvy, Adams & Reinhardt found that nearly half the investors they surveyed have more money in stocks now than 5 years ago. Still, only 14% said the market is more attractive, 3 times that many said it's less attractive. And 20% said they are investing for the very short term. That means if interest rates on bonds and other investments pick up, these investors are ready to abandon the stock market. As one analyst said, it does not bode well for stock market growth. Sheila Cast, ABC News, Washington.
It is your voice and your choice. I'm going to tell you, I am so down about some of the information we're getting from Washington. It is such a... Hi, Daria.
Hi, honey.
It is such
Welcome to Smart Money, everyone.
With the
Dolan.
Thank you very much.
Or the Dolan, if you're not careful.
That's right. It's very hard, in our opinion, to get good, straight information what's going on in Washington, number one, and focus in on the issue so once and for all, we can make an informed choice. There's those sound bites and interviews and all sorts of spins.
Should I be really nasty here? See, what we figured we would do with tonight's show is since it's very difficult really hearing what the candidates are saying that they're going to do, because sometimes they put a lot of words around and don't say what they're going to do.
They do?
We invited another Democrat and a Republican who are going to tell us what they're going to do, or at least as they understand it.
No spin doctors with our friends today.
Not at all.
Not with Steve
the only
and Jim
thing that
Jones.
spins is your chair.
Exactly right. The chairman of the American Stock Exchange and former Washingtonite, I guess you could say, Jim Jones, and managing director of Solomon Brothers office in Washington, our good friend Steve Bell, will be here. Not partisan stuff, just good straight information, straight from the shoulder from Steve and Jim. We can always depend on that.
That's right, and because we've got so much to talk about, we're going to look at taxes and capital gains and health care and Social Security before this half hour is over.
Yeah.
We're not even going to give you a career tip, even though this is Wednesday. We're live. If you have a question concerning what you think you've heard the candidates say, or what you've interpreted them to say, or what you don't understand them saying, give us a call right now at 800-487-CNBC. And please also, you can start calling right now for phones across America. We're going to get a lot of phones in too. 800-487-CNBC.
I can't believe you just did a whole half-hour show in a minute and a half. We are so glad you made us part of your Wednesday. We're glad you joined us. 1-800-487-CNBC. We will be right back. Good stuff to come. I'm going to tell you one thing. When we talk about the 3 presidential candidates and a couple of 3 independent party candidates, I'm going to tell you I know more about their personal life, about 3 times more than I even care to know. But, hey, what about the issues? What do they have to say, or their parties have to say, about some of the big problems facing us now, and certainly for the next 4 years? Well, we have found not spin doctors, but I would call answer men with real good opinions.
Exactly, and interestingly enough, I'm going to tell you where they came from before they got to where they are today, so you'll understand why we've invited them here, although I will tell you right off the bat, neither of our guests is speaking specifically for the candidates or the parties. But joining us right now is Stephen Bell. He is a managing director of Solomon Brothers. He is a former staff director of the Senate Budget Committee, when they still had a budget down there. Also, James Jones, chairman and CEO of the American Stock Exchange, and he is a former Democratic congressman from Oklahoma and chairman of the House Budget Committee, again, when there were still budgets that we could live with. And so welcome, gentlemen. Nice to see both of you.
And both of them left just in time. Jim Jones, under either President Bush or a new Clinton administration, taxes higher? Or not?
I tell you what I'm thinking is going to happen in the next 4 years. You're going to see some fundamental changes in tax policy, going to more of a consumption-based tax with more of an emphasis on deductions that will be geared towards savings and investment. I think that movement is gaining steam. Obviously, there will have to be some revenue increases over the next 4 years if we're serious about getting the deficit down.
Jim Jones, when I say revenue increases...
That's taxes.
Thank you, Jim. Okay. But that's what you mean by that.
But more on the consumption side.
Yeah. And you know, I'll start to say Governor Clinton, President Clinton, whatever, has already said if he's president that there would be tax increases on the very highest income levels.
Well, it's always interesting to me, though. We keep hearing above $200,000. Is not the presidential salary $200,000? Yes. Where does it start, at $200,001?
Well, no, for a couple. It's 136 and above. I mean, so you have a joint income's 200, single person 136 and above. So, you know.
All right. Now, speaking as a Republican, assuming, which may be a dumb assumption, that you're going to vote for President Bush come next Tuesday, he has made a great deal of noise about the fact that you better vote for me or you're going to see much higher taxes. Can Bush really escape the next 4 years without raising taxes himself?
Nobody's going to escape the next 4 years. We're going to have some tax increases of some kind. My own view, and Chairman Jones knows this very well because he used to be kind of my boss, is that, you know, we need to have some tax increases on consumption. Senator Nunn, Senator Domenici have both come out with a bipartisan plan indicating a radical change in the tax code, just like Jim just outlined. I think it's inevitable that has to happen. The present tax just does not work. The system really punishes people who want to save and invest. They're going to have to change that in the new world.
That is something you really ought to underline because it's a sleeper in this campaign. People have talked about the fact that our tax code encourages debt and encourages consumption. And there's been this talk for several years about a consumption-based tax that would reward investment and savings.
Yeah.
And most people have put it in the category of a European-style value-added tax. That's not what we're talking about. And I think Congress, if they get some leadership from the next president, will give serious attention and move toward a tax form that will encourage savings and investment. And that's very important.
I may say one thing, Jim Jones, you are the co-author, one of the major architects of the last major capital gains cut. Obviously, you know of what you speak. Is that likely to be again or not?
Well, from a Bill Clinton point of view, he's already indicated that he favors capital gains for emerging companies, new companies, and for longer holding periods. I think his is for new companies, and if you hold it for 5 years, you get the capital gains differential. Yeah. From the standpoint of President Bush, he's for an across-the-board capital gains cut. So I think whichever one is president, there will be some capital gains reduction in the next 4 years.
You agree, Steve?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's inevitable. We didn't get it this time because of as much personality and politics as it is policy. So I think it's going to happen.
The votes were there in both the House and Senate to pass it, but at a leadership level, there was a lot of maneuvering going on that prevented it from coming out.
Done. Yeah.
Right. Are we going to be able to get beyond this maneuvering that we've seen for 4 years? I mean, we've really had a gridlocked Congress, and when Congress hasn't been gridlocked, the president has vetoed things that probably should have had a second look. Are we going to get beyond this if Bush is reelected? Are we going to get beyond this if Clinton goes in there?
Oh, I think either way. It's this kind of gridlock we've had the last 5 or 6 years is very unnatural. Everyone always says, oh, it's because we have Democrats controlling Congress and Republicans controlling the White House. I think it's deeper than that. It's because the American people haven't made their minds up yet about some big, important issues. Where should spending go? Where should taxes come from? What are we going to do to compete in this global world? How do we handle the inner cities? Americans are as ambivalent on that as they are on anything else. And I think the representatives of the people represent them pretty well. They're ambivalent too.
But haven't we seen a partisanship develop?
No question about it.
And develop not with George Bush in the presidency or with Ronald Reagan. I mean, it seemed to me that everybody worked better pre-1980.
Well, it goes back to
it
goes back to 1981, and Steve knows that on the House side, which was under Democratic control when I was chairman, we were trying to put together a bipartisan effort, and I think we could have succeeded. But a decision was made at the White House and the Reagan White House to make it a partisan showdown. And then the Democrats retaliated, and it's been high partisanship ever since. I think we're about to get out of that because elections are important. And people are saying they're tired of it. They want some movement. They want some responsible, accountable action. And I think that's one of the messages that will come out of this election. Plus, don't forget, there will be 130 to 150 new faces in the Congress, and they're hearing something different. And the ones that I have met are significantly more bipartisan than the ones they're replacing. So I think that's an improvement.
Good, thank you, Jim. Let's go to the phones to Florida. Hi, George, welcome.
How you doing?
Hiya.
My question is, I've never heard anyone talk about the rate increases that doctors for the past 20 years, the rate increases have been well in excess of inflation. And nobody seems to be addressing them as part of the problem.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because we're going to go right to health care. Let's talk health care. Jim, let's kick it off and let Steve chime in, obviously.
There's a critical difference between the two candidates on this, is there not?
Hard to tell.
Yeah, it's...
Hello.
No, I think both of them have been rather vague on what their health care cost-cutting programs would be. And both of them have been somewhat vague and ambivalent on what their new programs would be. I think there's going to be a cost-cutting program regardless of who's president. I think it is more likely to be what I would call a pro-competition model, where you you take the purchasing power of the government or large entities and you really try to get cost efficiencies when they buy a policy.
Is it realistic, Jim?
Oh, I think so.
I mean, I'm happy to hear it, but I don't know.
No, I think
can we fund these changes?
Well, sure. I think these changes will save money. I think there's a lot of things that are going to happen in healthcare, but what I don't think is going to happen anytime soon is some big resolution of the problem of universal access to all forms of therapy. I mean, MRIs as well as the stethoscope, to put it in symbolic terms.
Sure.
That's not going to be resolved very quickly, and that is not a partisan issue, by the way. Neither Democrats nor Republicans have yet sorted out
have the answer
on that.
Well, we have an interesting situation with the state of Oregon, which is looking and has adopted the idea of rationing health care.
Well, that's close to right. Yeah. I mean,
truly. I mean, they've made a
more
list.
explicitly. Yeah, they've done it very explicitly instead of as we do it, kind of around.
Now, I think the Supreme Court is going to yet reach a decision on whether they can do that at all, but might we see, even on a smaller scale, a sort of triage or rationing of care?
Well, anytime you're going to cut costs, you're going to ration health care, because it means ipso facto we cannot have all the health care that we're having now unless we're willing to pay more for it, and we're not willing to do that. And so there will be rationing one way or the other. Some very interesting experiments are going on in the states. Hawaii has basically a national health insurance program for the state. Other states like Oregon have a government ration program. Other states have managed care programs. Cities have different kinds of programs. There's a lot of experimentation going on, and I think from that we're going to see a national health program that will cut costs.
The big E word, Steve Bell, entitlement. Something has to happen here.
We've been talking about entitlements for many, many years. The problem there is real simple: Social Security, and the next part of the problem is Medicare.
And government pensions being the third.
No, but that's not, you can handle government pensions outside of Social Security. The problem is very simply that when you talk to conservative people about saving money, they will tell you, let's cut all these programs, but don't cut Social Security or Medicare.
But it's 38 million votes is one reason.
And the problem is that most of the money is in Social Security and Medicare. We've made some changes in 1983. Social Security amendments made some changes, and we've lengthened the retirement age. It'll go into effect next century. We increased taxes. But at some point, we have to face the fact that the Medicare Trust Fund is going to be in reasonably serious shape sometime in the next 5 or 6 or 8 years.
Yeah, we had the former head of Medicare here, and she was very quick to admit it ain't going to last forever.
People ought to pay attention to that.
That's indicative of what happens, at least to me as an outsider in Washington. When it was proposed, in 65, Medicare, they projected by 1988 it would cost $8.8 billion. Well, they got the numbers right, but they needed to drop the decimal. I believe it cost $88 billion in 1988. How could they have miscalculated like that?
If you go back to the 1970s, the combination of Congress and the administrations, both parties had some very irresponsible policies, particularly in the early 1970s. Indexing Social Security added some extremely big costs that we were not anticipating, particularly when they ratcheted it up by a big amount and then indexed it.
Jim, hold the thought. Please hold right there. We're going to take a break and come back. Ratcheting up, remember that, okay?
I will. I'll remember it deeply. We're talking with Jim Jones, chairman of the American Stock Exchange, Steve Bell, managing director. Salmon Brothers, we'll be back.
Right back. We are talking issues with two good friends of ours. Steve Bell is managing director of the Salomon Brothers office in Washington. Does he know a little bit about Washington?
He's managing director of Salomon Brothers.
Oh, exactly. In the Washington office. And Jim Jones. Remember Jim Jones?
Yes.
He is chairman of the American Stock Exchange. Jim, quickly, we're talking ratcheting up and the COLAs and it getting a little bit out of control.
Basically, the question was, how did Medicare get so far out of control from what it was promised in 65? In the 1970s, we piled on a whole bunch of new benefits and decreased the payment for those benefits. And that's what we're living with.
That's where we stand.
Okay. Quickly, let's get back to the phones. Russell in Alabama, welcome.
Yeah, how can we vote? How can we vote for Bill Clinton when his state is 50th in 4 important aspects of government?
All right, let's ask Jim Jones. What the heck, Jim?
Well, of course, Oklahoma is next to Arkansas, and I've watched Arkansas over the years, and Arkansas was way down and has been for many years. And what Bill Clinton has done is taken a very pro-business attitude and increased jobs there, and he's done a very good job of it. He's taken 2 issues, jobs and education, and it's been recognized across the country. He's probably done as well or better than any other governor in those 2 issues.
Bottom line, Jim Jones, we'll ask Steve Bell the same question. Election day, who's going to be elected or re-elected?
I think on the electoral vote, Bill Clinton will win it big.
Big time. Steve
and
Bell.
Perot is no effect.
Up until last Sunday night, he would have been, and I think he will continue to decline.
Steve Bell.
Yeah, I think I think Bill Clinton will win. I think it's going to be pretty close, and I think that there is the possibility still for President Bush to win this thing. There is a closure happening. I think it's absolutely happening, but it's also very typical for this time of the presidential
At the last stages.
Sure. Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I wish we had more time. Jim Jones from the American Stock Exchange. Steve, our best to all of the gang at Solomon in Washington.
Thank you.
And Derek Mon, your chairman, with whom we had breakfast. Thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate it.
I would remind all of you, on behalf of our guests this evening, it is your voice and your choice, so be sure to get out there and vote. As we get ready for Phones Across America, we're going to show you just a couple of more statements our guests didn't have time to state here on air right now, so you can read about them, and we'll be back.
Back with phones.
This is CNN.
Live from the world's financial capital, New York City, this is Moneyline with Lou Dobbs.
Good evening. Continuity and change. President-elect Bill Clinton today said he will pursue stability for the financial markets while working to spur economic growth. President-elect Clinton today said his policies will strengthen the market system, not weaken it. The president-elect in Little Rock starting to shape the nation's first Democratic administration in 12 years. And returning to the White House, President Bush today pledged his full support for the new administration, but stuck to his guns on a matter of economic principle today, vetoing a $27 billion urban aid and tax bill. The president-elect supported that tax bill, which would have raised taxes on upper-income Americans while giving tax breaks to inner cities. Tax legislation will surely resurface early next year as part of a big legislative push by the new administration in its first 100 days. Irv Chapman reports from Washington.
Bill Clinton won election with one basic promise at the top of his agenda.
We will spare no effort to restore growth, jobs, and incomes to the American people.
From Wall Street to Capitol Hill, there is a growing consensus in support.
You do have to have something in place to sort of kickstart this economy, get more people back to work, allow for a transition from a heavily defense-based economy to one that is non-defense. So you've got to take that talent and put it into other uses.
And Wall Street seems prepared to accept a plan with a modest price tag if, once the economy begins to grow, a firm deficit reduction plan kicks in.
I think the markets would not be alarmed if the spending increases asked for initially don't exceed $25 or $30 billion. Once you start going above that, the alarm bells might be going off a little bit more loudly in the credit markets.
Clinton has proposed to accelerate spending on roads, bridges, and railroad lines, as well as job retraining. He plans tax incentives to encourage new investment in factory modernization and expansion.
Once you get businesses investing, that will get people back to work. Second of all, Bill Clinton has talked about a targeted capital gains tax reduction. And I think at this point, with this new Congress, there's bipartisan support for that kind of idea.
Winning bipartisan majorities to cut the deficit by trimming spending on health, farm subsidies, and payments to individuals will take more work. With an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress, Bill Clinton's initiative should sail through without much need for compromise. In his political vocabulary, the word gridlock will be replaced with honeymoon. Irv Chapman, CNN Business News, Washington.
While it may not be unusual for corporate figures to move to Washington, the reverse is not often the case. But this week's Business World guest did just that. A former congressman, he became head of the American Stock Exchange. Now there's talk he could go back to Washington, perhaps with a top position at either the Treasury Department or the Office of Management and Budget. The chairman and CEO of the AMEX, James Jones, joins me here in New York. Mr. Jones, part of Governor Clinton's plan relies on much higher taxes for the wealthy. How can he get that through without a filibuster from the Republicans?
Well, I think Bill Clinton is essentially a bipartisan person after an election. I think he will want to bring the Republican leadership on the ground floor with his economic program, And if he does that, and if it's as sound as I think it's going to be, I think he's going to have substantial Republican support. Also, I think you have to recognize he has a number of top CEOs around the country who have supported his campaign and who believe that we have to get the economy moving again, who also believe we have deficit reduction, and I think they will accept higher taxes if it's going to that kind of a sound program.
All right, the markets have not exactly accepted Mr. Clinton's program. When it became aware of rumors that he might front-load it to get the economy moving faster, the bond market went into the tank. What's the likely outcome? What's he likely to do? Is he likely to pay attention to the markets?
Well, I think Bill Clinton has been very sensitive to the financial markets. He started meeting in small groups and making calls to financial leaders since last August to let them know that he's a sound person, he's not irresponsible on fiscal policy. And I think the markets have actually adjusted quite well. They're going to wait on what his program is, who his appointees are. But the bond market would have gone down regardless of who was elected, because I think there is an anticipation that interest rates would go up a little bit regardless of who was president. Stock market has adjusted quite well.
If you were head of OMB, what would be your first advice to President Clinton?
Well, I don't think that's likely, but if he were asking for advice, I would say a short-term stimulus package that would be about 60% psychological leadership to let the country know where we're going and how we're going to get there, about a 40% fiscal stimulus that would have a defined beginning and a defined ending, and then virtually simultaneously with that, a long-term deficit reduction plan that could actually fulfill his promise of reducing the deficit 50% in his first term. If you had that combination of short-term stimulus, long-term deficit reduction, I think the financial markets would respond very positively, and that would help get the whole growth pattern going.
His short-term stimulus is supposed to be $20 billion a year for 4 years on construction, road building, sewers, and so forth. What's the $20 billion program going to do to a $5 trillion economy?
Well, I don't think a big stimulus package is called for. First of all, the underlying fundamentals of the economy, of wringing out the excesses of the 1980s, is pretty much there. So it's basically waiting for some leadership and a little bit of stimulus to get people back to work. And so I think it's the confidence factor and some stimulus in terms of perhaps an investment tax credit to get the private sector to buying their manufactured goods, to get the private sector going, infrastructure investment. Those kinds of things will help it move.
If the economy begins moving up next year, how much of a debt will Mr. Clinton have to George Bush for bringing interest rates down and wringing out those excesses?
Well, I think those excesses began to be wrung out by the private sector. The layoffs in the industry, the retooling, those kinds of things would have occurred anyway. But clearly the 1980s, particularly the Reagan period, was very excessive, and President Bush helped to wring out some of that.
All right, well, Mr. Jones, thank you very much for being our guest on Business World.
Thank you.
And when we come back, General Motors, the mark of excellence or marked for bankruptcy?
This is CNN.
Now, if Mr. Clinton's focus in the early days of his new administration is going to be the economy, what is his priority, his first priority? Job growth or deficit reduction? Joining us this morning is a man who may have some input on those decisions. He is James Jones, and he's the chairman of the American Stock Exchange. Jim, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
We say you may have some influence over this because, of course, you're mentioned as a possible candidate for the new cabinet. Any comment?
In the great mentioners columns, that's all speculation, because nobody knows what is going to actually happen.
Have they called you? Have they called you? Have you called them?
No.
You're talked about as a man who's going to go to the Office of Management and Budget.
Well, I don't believe everything I read in the paper.
Would you like the job?
I think it's going to be a very exciting time, because there really is an opportunity to do something about the economy on a long-range basis, and that's exciting.
Whomsoever gets the job at OMB, is the first priority getting that deficit down?
I think the first priority is get the economy moving again, and that's going to take a slight stimulus, but almost simultaneously with that has to be a long-term deficit reduction package. Otherwise, the whatever growth in the economy starts will peter out.
Can you have it all ways? Can you have a fiscal stimulus package to encourage the economy, get it moving, and reduce the deficit over the long haul? Can you?
Yes, you can, but it has to be done in sequence. One of the mistakes the Reagan administration made was not sequencing their own economic program. And if it's properly sequenced, you can have both, and you can have long-term steady growth.
Properly sequenced means gets the spending up front and the deficit reduction comes later, right?
That's right.
All right. Let's talk a little bit nearer term, if we may. President-elect Clinton is going to be holding a summit with business leaders. Do you expect to be invited to that?
Well, one of his staff called and talked to me last week about who all should be invited, so I don't know if I'm going to be invited or not, but I think it's a very good idea. Governor Clinton had the support of a lot of executives in all kinds of industries and financial leaders as well during the campaign, and it would be a shame not to use that talent to help him get started in his administration.
The purpose for this summit, of course, is to take the pulse of the economy. If you were invited to the summit, what would you tell Mr. Clinton about the economy's current health?
Well, I would say, first of all, it does need a little bit of stimulus. It needs a lot of psychological leadership, telling the American people where we're going and how we're going to get there with a plan. I think the underlying fundamentals of much of the economy are pretty sound. The excesses of the 1980s have been wrung out pretty much. So I think what it needs is a slight stimulus and long-term responsible fiscal policy.
We've seen recent signs, most recently the rebound in retail sales, that indicate the economy may be getting better of its own accord. What do you think?
Well, there are some signs that the economy is getting better, but we've had 2 or 3 of those indications in the last couple or 3 years. And I think inattention to the economy has kept it from sustaining its recovery.
Do you think there's a danger that this is going to hark back to the domestic summit that Mr. Carter held back in the late 1970s, which looked very closely at the national malaise? A little worried about being involved in another of those?
I'm really not. I think Governor Clinton brings an approach to government that perhaps hasn't been seen since the 1960s in terms of activism and responsibility. And I think that's the kind of business summit he's talking about.
If you were installed at OMB, how would you cut the deficit over the long haul?
Well, it's not going to be, that's not an answer that one can give in 30 seconds, but essentially...
Well, you've got a full minute, so you go right ahead.
Well, in this case, we can cut the whole thing.
Oh, please do.
No, I think there has to be some trimming of the entitlement programs, the automatic cost of living.
Does that include Social Security?
Social Security is off the table right now. The big cost in entitlement programs are health care, and that's got to be one of the early issues that's tackled. You've got to reduce the very rapidly increasing cost of health care. There will have to be some revenue increases, and I think a fundamental look at the tax code and think very seriously about changing the tax code from what is now consumption-oriented to one that will be investment and savings-oriented.
Are you talking about a value-added tax?
Not a value-added tax, but perhaps something like a business transfer tax or something like a universal IRA.
All right, James Jones, chairman of the American Stock Exchange and possible Clinton cabinet appointee, we shall see, but thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And Business Day will be right back.
Since the election, those stocks have risen every day, while the Dow Jones Industrials have fallen 3 days out of the past 5. Today, that pattern continued as the Dow Jones Industrials lost and the NASDAQ and American Exchange Composite Indexes gained. Terry Keenan has the story from Wall Street.
As President-elect Clinton tries to map out his economic policy, Wall Street is betting it will include a kinder, gentler approach to small business.
I think his heart is really with emerging companies, with growth companies, with smaller companies, with entrepreneurs. And I think the bulk of his economic policies and incentives will be geared toward helping those companies grow into big companies.
Jones, a Wall Streeter with close ties to Clinton, says any plan would likely include 2 favorite themes of the Clinton campaign: investment tax credits to spur small business and a capital gains tax break for investors who back small companies and stick with them.
I think small and medium-sized companies need access to development capital, which is why I favor the venture capitalist proposal for a long-term capital gains tax.
On Wall Street, investors aren't waiting for specifics. While the blue chips have languished, small stocks have exploded. In a rush to get in on the action, over-the-counter trading volume has exceeded volume here at the New York Stock Exchange for 4 days running. The NASDAQ index of over-the-counter stocks has closed sharply higher every day since Election Day and is up 7.5% since October 1st. But it's not just politics propelling small stocks. Big money coming out of some battered blue chips is looking for a place to go.
The market is reevaluating some of the old assumptions, like big stocks are necessarily safer and less volatile than smaller stocks. IBM is a perfect example.
It's an example that could set a trend. If investors conclude a fresh approach to the economy demands a fresh portfolio to fit it. Terry Keenan, CNN Business News, New York.